Good afternoon. My name is Jim Turk, and I'm the director of the Center for Free Expression. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I'm speaking to you today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty signed by multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. On behalf of the Center for Free Expression at Ryerson University and the event's co-sponsors, which today are the Association of Canadian Publishers, the Edmonton Public Library, PEN Canada, the Toronto Public Library, and the Vancouver Public Library, I want to welcome you to the Center for Free Expression's virtual forum series panel on Canadian authors and books, an endangered species, ? Although there are many Canadian writers and genuine public interest in Canadian topics, why is there a decline in sales and a concern about borrowing of Canadian books? What does this mean for Canada, and what can be done? We have a remarkable panel to discuss these issues with you and to draw you into the conversation. I'd like to introduce our panelists. The first is James Lorimer. Jim is president and co-owner of the Canadian publisher James Lorimer and Company. After attending the University of Manitoba and completing a PhD in economics at the London School of Economics, Jim taught at York University. Shortly thereafter, he and two friends started a book publishing company focusing on Canadian social issues and has been publishing ever since. He's also been a cultural activist on Canadian book reading, including 2 terms on the Toronto Public Library Board, an early report on book reading, engagement in multiple book industry organizations, and since 2017, he has worked with the More Canada Volunteer Think Tank Initiative. Welcome, Jim. Our second panelist is Pilar Martinez. Pilar is the Chief Executive Officer of the Edmonton Public Library. She is very active in the library community, chairing the Canadian Urban Libraries Council, serving as public lending rights on the, serving on the Public Lending Rights Commission, and is adjunct professor for the University of Alberta's School of Library and Information Studies, where she also serves as a school council member. Pilar's work has been honored with the Canadian Library Association Ken Haycock Award for promoting librarianship, the Library Association of Alberta's President's Award, and the Distinguished Alumni Award by the Library and Information Studies Alumni Association at the University of Alberta. Welcome, Pilar. Our third panelist is Barb Minnette. Barb began her book-selling career in 1973. When she and her partner Doug Minett founded the Bookshelf in Guelph, Ontario. At the time, publishers told Doug and Barb that Guelph didn't need any more bookstores, even though there was only a few books available in a stationery store in downtown Guelph. Barb and Doug persevered anyways. Along with receiving the Canadian Booksellers Association Bookseller of the Year Award, Barb has received the YMCA Woman of Distinction Award for Guelph and Wellington County. As well, she's been honored with the award of an honorary doctorate degree by the University of Guelph in 2018. Welcome, Barb.
Hello.
Our third panelist is Hayden Taylor. Our fourth panelist. Drew is an Ojibwe from the Curve Lake First Nation in north of Peterborough, Ontario, has had a multifaceted literary career, from performing stand-up comedy at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., to being artistic director of Canada's premier native theater company, Native Earth Performing Arts. Drew is an award-winning playwright who has written more than 20 plays, a journalist whose column appears regularly in several Canadian newspapers and magazines, a filmmaker who wrote and directed Redskins, Trichters, and Puppy Stew, a documentary on Native humor for the National Film Board of Canada and for the CBC, and co-created Searching for Winnetou, an exploration of Germany's fascination with North American Indigenous culture. He is also a screenwriter for a number of Canadian television series, including Beachcombers and North of 60. In 2007, the made-for-TV movie he wrote, titled In a World Created by a Drunken God, which was nominated for 3 Gemini Awards, including Best Movie. It was based on a play which he had written, which was a finalist for the Governor General Award for drama. He also writes nonfiction. One of his works includes a 4-volume set entitled Funny, You Don't Look Like One. His 2010 novel, Motorcycles and Sweetgrass, was a finalist for the Governor General's Award for fiction. And his most recent novel, Chasing Painted Horses, brings his publication total to 33 books. Drew has served as the writer-in-residence at the Burton House in Dawson City, Yukon, the University of Michigan, the University of Western Ontario, the University of Lüneburg in Germany, Ryerson University, Wilfrid Laurier, as well as at a host of Canadian theater companies. And with this remarkable history of work, he's won a number of accolades for his work. The Floyd S. Chalmers Award, the Dora Maver Moore Award, Canadian Authors Literary Award, an honorary doctorate of laws from Mount Allison University, Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Award, the Ontario Premier's Award for Creative Art and Design, and the Victoria Martin Lynch Stoughton Award for Outstanding Artistic Achievement in Theater. Drew told me that oddly enough, the thing that his mother was most proud of was his ability to make spaghetti from scratch. This remarkable group is going to be moderated by an equally remarkable person, and that is Victor Rabinovitch. For over 11 years, Victor was president and CEO of Canada's largest museum institution, the Canadian Museum of Civilization, now named the Canadian Museum of History, and the Canadian War Museum. Previously, Victor was a public servant in both federal and provincial governments and was a staff member of the Canadian Labour Congress. He was an assistant deputy minister in departments such as human resource development, fisheries and oceans, labor, and Canadian heritage. In addition to serving with many community organizations, Victor is a distinguished fellow in the Queen's University School of Policy Studies. He writes widely on issues in history, identity, and cultural expression. He is also a recipient of the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal. So welcome to Victor and to our panel. Now for the audience, our format today is the panel. Victor is going to moderate a conversation amongst the panel for about 45 to 50 minutes, after which he'll turn to the audience for questions that any of you may have. If those in the audience will look down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. At any point during the conversation, you have a question that you'd like to pose to the panel, just click on that Q&A button and write out your question. And I'd suggest that you do it as the discussion goes along. So if you don't wait until he turns to the audience to write your question, just put it down whenever it comes to you in the course of the discussion. And then Victor will turn to Ange Holmes, the coordinator of the center, who's monitoring the questions, who will read out the first question for the panel to discuss. That's all from me. Over to you, Victor, and panelists, and look forward to listening to you.
Jim Turk, thank you so much for pulling this together, and thanks to you and Ange and everybody technical for making this happen. And of course, we know that we have visitors, participants from across the country and outside the country. So that's just quite wonderful. I'm going to tip my hand and say right away as moderator that my biggest concern today is that Canadian publishing, English and French, is headed towards being a lot like the Canadian feature film industry. And that would mean that our books will not be seen, that they won't be distributed commercially, they won't be findable, identifiable, and therefore fewer and fewer will be read. I mean, that's my fear. And I know that there's indications that this is happening in the marketplace, but there's also lots of positive things that are happening. And so when we talk today, we're going to hear the positive as well as the problematic, and we'll exchange between ourselves and with members of the viewing and listening audience, ideas, concerns, solutions, things that we should be talking about. So let me start off with a question, just a very simple question, and it's for each of the panelists, and we'll do it in turn. And that is, in your personal view as a panelist and in your personal view as such an experienced participant in the Canadian book universe, how do you judge the state of Canadian publishing today? How do you judge it personally from your experience? Let me start with you, Drew Hayden Taylor.
Well, I am in no position to argue or criticize. I have 33 books published, and in the last COVID year, hopefully, I finished a novel, 2 plays, and a book of nonfiction. So, publishing has been very fortunate to me. I've worked with about 5 or 6 different publishers, depending on whether it's my fiction or my nonfiction, my YA stuff, whatever. And as of this point, I have not really had much difficulty in working with them, though I am getting concerned about the amalgamation of all the big publishers coming into one big publishing empire. And I'm worried about how that's going to affect everybody. I'm pretty well established. I'm worried about the younger people, the first generation writers who are trying to get their first books out there, and how it's going to affect them and how they're going to get in there and fight. I'm an old dog at this, so I'm jaded, and I'm ready to retire and go out and shovel snow for the rest of my life. So that's basically it. To use a quote from Saturday Night Live, Canadian publishing has been very, very good to me, but times are changing. The whole world is changing. Publishing is changing. The media is changing everything. I believe it was somebody who said when we're coming in to do this to keep things short, because people now have short attention spans. I don't know how the younger generation can handle a 300-page novel anymore or whatever. So I don't know. I'm worried for the future. Let me leave it at that.
We'll come back on that, and we'll come back also on your publishing experience and your Canadian publishers. Jim Lorimer, your experience is almost as long as Drew's.
Oh.
Jim, you're muted.
Sorry, that doesn't happen often. My take on the situation is that from the 1970s, we had an explosion of Canadian writing and publishing, and an explosion of interest. In the 1970s, when you published books that were of interest, it was natural to expect to sell. If you were in a small independent publisher, which I've always been, it was natural to expect that there would be 10 or 20 or 30,000 copies of a successful book sold. And I have to say that those of us who were in the industry at that time thought this is pretty straightforward. As long as you publish books that are good that people want to read, it's actually fairly easy to be in this business, which was lucky because the business isn't easy, but it gave us a chance to learn. You know, there was a cushion for our mistakes. But Drew's experience actually speaks to how I see the situation today, which is that we've gone over a peak, and what's happened is that the creation and writing and publishing of Canadian books is as strong as ever. In fact, I think there are many ways that you can say that what's being published today is even more diverse, even more interesting, even more challenging than has ever been the case. But at the same time, there's been a really drastic decline in the success that Canadian writers are having at reaching readers. And the decline has been drastic. So it depends on if you measure it over 10 years, it's easy to see a decline of 50% in the market share that Canadian authors and publishers have of Canadian book sales in Canada. If you look over 15 years, you see even more decline. And so people like Drew, you know, that I because we had a pre-meeting, and I thought, well, I've seen Drew's great movie about Indians and cottagers, and I have to say that I've never been in a bookstore and I've never been in a library where I was face to face with one of his books. But if I had been, I know that movie experience would have led me to say, oh, I better pick up that book. But I took a look at what Drew's actual experience is, and how many copies of his book sold last year, because now in the book world we can see these numbers. And a very successful author with a very successful book is selling 1,000 copies a year of a really important novel. That's what we've come to. So to me, my experience is that we're in a state of considerable decline, not in creation and writing, as he emphasized, but rather in what's happening in the channels that get books from writers and publishers to readers.
That expression in mind, you've really put your finger on something, the channel that gets the product to the readers. Okay, Pilar talks about one of those channels, one of the key channels from the Edmonton Public Library standpoint. Pilar Martinez.
Thank you, Victor. And I think it's such a good question. And I certainly don't have the intimate knowledge that my esteemed panelists do about the state of publishing in Canada.
Did you hear that, esteemed?
Not for long.
You promised, Jim. No. And I'm just going to comment on something that Jim mentioned. And we did an analysis, and I think I've talked to some of my colleagues in other larger public libraries of usage of Canadian materials in our library over the last 5 years. And amazingly, it has remained steady, unlike the overall usage of adult physical materials. So I think that is not a bad thing. And I certainly appreciate the challenges that Canadian publishers face, given the absolute sheer volume of material that's published to the South. And really, I think just the competition for content that we're facing now in our society, there's so many things vying for people's attention, like the internet, got social media, video games, streaming media, movies, Netflix, and even different genres like graphic novels that didn't exist, 20, 30 years ago. And I think we live in a world that's really driven by bestsellers and awards. And while of course, the physical material usage still dominates in public libraries, there's a huge growth and shift to the use of digital content, so ebooks and e-audio, and that's just been accelerated by the pandemic. And the digital really provides it has so many barriers to libraries providing access. There's expense to it, and the access is almost sometimes limited. So, and the ebook usage is defined by the vendors, the platforms. So they often play a role in the patron acquisition or the customer acquisition through their marketing. So they're sort of usurping the library's role as a curator and promoting those bestsellers and award winners, and not the Canadian content that we would like to see. So in a nutshell, I think there are some things, of course, that we can do together to help change things. And I look forward to hearing the rest of the comments from the panelists.
So you're saying that the vendor, the supplier of an ebook, even if it's through the library website, that vendor is not really the library. It's really a third party.
Exactly, Victor.
It's almost as if the library is saying, here's a television channel to watch, or here's a radio channel to watch, to listen to. And the vendor is making decisions on what to promote and how to promote.
Correct. So the customer, the patron, can bypass the library and go directly to that third party website or app and borrow directly from the app. So bypassing the library. And there's a vested interest in that vendor, that platform promoting content, and they're not favorable to Canadian content. It's more difficult to access, it's more difficult to find.
This is new for many of us. Let's go to another channel, sometimes underestimated and yet exceedingly important, traditionally and in present time. And that's you, Barb, talking to us from Guelph and from your experience.
Okay, well, the last year, which we can call the COVID era, we have been so incredibly busy, and we are so grateful. Last March, we had a functioning website, which mainly people accessed to check cinema reviews, even though we had a lot of book reviews on it. But last March, we put it out on social media that we were delivering books to people in Guelph for free. And that has been we have been so busy, and people have been so grateful. But I'm not saying that the book business has not been stressful for us and most independent bookstores. When we first started in 1973, there were the chains, that's what they were called. Then they called them box stores. And then Amazon came along, and then the Kindle came along. So we've had a lot of challenges. But presently, I really find that service from publishers is so much better. We used to have to wait 2 or 3 weeks to get a book. Now we wait 3 to 5 days. So it's really terrific for service. EDI has made in-store processing so much easier for staffing. And EDI, electronic,
I think it's electronic data interchange.
Data interchange.
You're sending orders back and forth electronically.
Yeah, so that's been really helpful. It's really been made our job less tedious. But I also have to say that in our store, 8 out of 10 bestsellers last year were Canadian. And one of the things that we've done is we have flagged Canadian books on our website with a little Canadian flag. And I actually think people are looking to buy Canadian. They just don't know how to they're having trouble accessing it. So
that is a partially very positive story. And I should point out that in Guelph, Barb and her husband and now her kids have run an integrated, what should we call it, a cultural center.
An arts emporium.
An arts emporium. Oh, that sounds good. Should put that by Highway 401, an arts emporium. Anybody who laughs gets paid extra. So you have a film, a cinema, together with a restaurant, together with the bookstore.
Live entertainment. Well, we used to have, half of us is closed. The cinemas aren't open and bars aren't open, so there's no live music. But maybe that's why people are just really, really relishing books. And another thing I wanted to mention about books is these days, whenever you look at TV or any Zoom meetings, people always have their bookcases in the background, and I think that's not just by accident. So I think books have just they have more recent cachet, which is great.
Right. Okay, so it's a range of experiences, a very interesting panel. I'm going to ask a second question, but I want us to be able to question each other and talk to each other a bit about this. The title of the entire panel is that we're worrying about Canadian publishing being an endangered species, ? Is it an endangered species? So based on your experiences, and you've talked about this already a bit, do you think you're having more problems, less problems, similar in reaching Canadian readers? Do you think that you're having more problems, less problems reaching Canadian buyers, Canadian audiences? One of the reasons I'm asking this, and I'll hold it up, is a really fine study and a very worrying study from a voluntary task force that Jim Lorimer was so involved in pulling together. And the title is More Canada, Increasing Canadians' Awareness and Reading of Canadian Books. Some of the findings in this, and I believe some of the more recent findings of sales in the marketplace, would show that we really are having a problem reaching the Canadian marketplace and reaching out to potential Canadian readers. But maybe the stats aren't completely right. So I'm throwing it out to you. In your experience, do you believe you're having more problems in reaching readers, in reaching audiences? And should we go in the same order again? But by all means, let's talk with each other. Start off with Drew. Are you having any problems?
Well, you have to keep in mind, I work in a niche field. I work in First Nations Indigenous literature. But with that being said, I also work in a double niche field in many ways. I work in theater, and half of my books are published plays. And very rarely do I see people walking down the street going, geez, you know, I could really go for a native play right about now. There's not a lot of sales of native plays off the shelf. And I assume Barb would agree with me. But the thing being, as I assume everybody here knows, and I've learned this through my work, the fact that if you want to make, outside of being Margaret Atwood, if you want to make real money as a Canadian author, you have to get into course curriculum. And that is where I, as a native author, come into my own. My plays are hoovered up by elementary schools, high schools, colleges, universities, etc. They're taught. My novels are taught. My nonfiction is taught in those environments, and that is where the vast majority of my sales do come from. What was I going to say about all that? So for me, as long as there's curriculum happening out there, I think I'm going to be okay. Yeah, I'll leave it with that.
Pilar, I'm going to ask Jim for some stats and some experience that you may have gathered more recently on sales. But I want to jump to Pilar first. And you were laughing, shaking your head as Drew talked about being in a niche area. And I wondered whether you were reacting to that.
I thought he's got a great sense of humor. So that's what I was laughing at. Yeah, really. I mean, I think in terms of your question, Victor, did you want me to jump in or do you want to go to
Sure,
Jim?
why not? You jump in.
Okay, sure. So I think as I was talking about the competition, the one thing that I missed, which is a big sort of elephant in the room, is Amazon. So we know that Amazon is in the publishing market now. They don't sell to libraries. Their digital content is not sold to libraries. They own Audible. They don't sell that content to libraries. We know authors are being published directly by Amazon, so bypassing publishers. Because it's a really quick, convenient way for people to buy content. So I just didn't want to forget to mention the Amazon factor. I think the question about whether we're meeting the marketplace is a good one. And I think for us, it's not always easy for us to find Canadian content. It's not easy to analyze it. So I think that's a factor in terms of metadata, of some ways of a better ability to access Canadian content. I think we find that our library users are pretty well connected and know what's happening in terms of the Canadian literary scene. They really pay attention to that. And those award winners or nominated authors are always in demand. And local Edmonton, whether it's Toronto, Edmonton, local authors are often very much in demand. And I think libraries really are focusing on local and provincial collections. So I'm just going to use Edmonton as an example because I know that we have something called Capital City Press, where we feature physical content, so books of Edmonton in the area, traditional and self-published content. So there's lots of displays and signage. In Alberta, we have a program with the Book Publishers Association of Alberta and public libraries to provide digital access to Alberta ebooks and Indigenous ebooks through something called Alberta eBooks and the Prairie Indigenous ebook collection. And I think we play a huge role in promoting Canadian books. So I think we know from studies that we've done in terms of specific programs where we feature a Canadian book that it can increase usage, circulation by 2,400% by having things on our website, media, sort of Facebook Live programs, author talks. All of those things really have an impact. Our latest one was with, in January of 2021, was a book featuring by Kim Tui called V, about Vietnamese refugees in both French and English. And it just really thrived. So we know that marketing and promoting Canadian content brings attention to the users, and it has an impact on the way that those things are used. So I think public libraries, there's an opportunity for us to work together. There's a will to help ensure that the Canadian publishing industry thrives. Drew talked about being a writer, or Jim mentioned Drew was a writer in residence, and I think that is something public libraries across Canada do. We have writers in residence to support those emerging writers who help support other emerging writers. And often we know that writers sort of found their successes, many of them by using and having access to spaces in public libraries, like the Toronto's recently named Jack Rabinovitch Reading Room. So I think there's lots of
name. A good name.
Good name. I thought you'd like that. So I think the other factor is, and we don't really have, I know Jim has some research, but I think there could be more research, more market research to support publishers, to provide, to help them provide content that appeals to Canadian readers.
I want to come to Jim in a moment. I want to come back once again. You mentioned eAlberta, so that's a program to make Alberta books available.
Yes.
What about books published elsewhere in the country?
So most of the publishers use, besides what's known as Overdrive. So that's that third party platform that I was talking about, that they really have the biggest sort of market on an ebook platform.
And does Overdrive promote, make available Canadian content?
They do, but it's not as easy, and they're not always promoting Canadian content like we would on our website or other public libraries across Canada.
Jim, do you have numbers? Do you have impressions? Back to the core question. Are we having more difficulties or not in reaching Canadian readers, book buyers?
The great thing about the situation that we're in is that finally there's really good data available, not just on how the bookstore market works in Canada, but also we're starting to get really good data on what's going on with libraries. And so in the book business, it's been traditional to everybody's got opinions and everybody's got experience. And so we kind of share experiences and it goes, everybody's got their own opinion. And the great thing is that we now are getting really good data. So I know, for example, absolutely for sure, that indie bookstores like Barb's store in Guelph and all the other indie stores in Canada, which have a relatively small market share in Canada, is much smaller than it used to be. But the great thing about the indie stores is that 19%, in the last 12 months, 19% of the books they sold were Canadian authored. Okay, now so in other words, 1 out of every 5, roughly. So that's a smaller number than it was in the past, but it's still, I think of that as a respectable number, and it reflects the diversity and the interest and the consumer demand that exists for Canadian books. Okay, now, but as soon as we move to the whole retail book trade, all of a sudden we discover that Canadian authors' books, and these are all Canadian authors' books from all publishers, account for 12% of sales. So as soon as you hit the chain does much less with Canadian authors than the indie stores like Barb's do. And there's no reason why that should be the case apart from all the back-end business systems that are in play and all the pressures that are in play. But consumer demand and consumer taste is exemplified by what happens in the indie bookstores. And that's a percentage, by the way, that 12% is way lower. In 2005, we think the number was 27%. So the decline has been drastic, and it affects all the publishers of Canadian-owned books. And I'm talking market share. I'm not talking total book sales. because total book sales have been declining slightly in English Canada, but the Canadian share of the books that are being sold and read has been declining at a much more rapid rate.
I'm going to interrupt you. I'm going to interrupt you. This is a key point, because looked at from the outside, many people would say, oh, well, books are passé. That's in the past. We spend so much time now, as they say, Netflixing and relaxing. We spend so much time on screens. Books, what are books? And what you're saying is, in fact, book sales altogether are fairly stable.
And book reading. So magazine reading has gone down, newspaper reading has plummeted, but books, yes, the typical number that people talk about is a decline of 1 to 2% a year in the total number of books that are being sold in Canada. And book reading still is a very strong leisure time activity. And public libraries, to get to public libraries, the circulation, the last data from the group of public libraries that Pilar is the chair of, you know, there are 25 of those libraries, and their circulation is 100 million loans per year. And by the way, the digital side of that, the data that was reported is about 33 million. So the digital side is definitely something that's happened, as we all know. But the print side isn't, you know, it isn't that it's gone like this. So anyway, but here's where I want to, the point that I want to.
That's not our experience though, Jim, in terms of physical circulation. Books still are queen. No doubt about it. Physical materials are still dominant, but there has definitely been a decline in physical materials usage over the last 10 years.
Oh yes,
and a gradual increase. Yeah. That has not been our experience though with Canadian materials.
Yeah. No,
that has remained flat.
So Canadian materials have remained flat.
Well, yeah. But flat at what is I think the key point. Because the data that we now have from 2020, from a sample of about 25 public library systems that represent about 500 and some locations, I have the numbers here, show that public libraries are circulating about 10% of the books they circulate are Canadian authored. So in other words, if you compare what independent bookstores are able to achieve in terms of readership, sales and readership of Canadian books with what the chain and other, you know, Walmart and Costco and so on achieve at the 12% number, public libraries are succeeding even less in putting Canadian authored books into the hands of public library readers. And that's why the point that Pilar made about the role that public libraries play in creating awareness of books in all of the different things is so important. Because public libraries, it turns out, and there's great data about this too, that it turns out that the typical person who walks into a public library is about half of the time people walk out with a book they intended to borrow. The other half of the time they find a book in the library. So and that speaks to the role that libraries have of creating awareness, not just delivering books into people's hands, but also telling people about the books that are there. So the absence of Canadian books in the branches of public libraries is, of course, it's a self-fulfilling event. Few Canadian books in branch public libraries leads to few Canadian books being discovered and read. And that's what has happened in the public libraries. And I say that the biggest reason for that is not because public librarians aren't fans of Canadian books. It's because they rely on plumbing, the digital plumbing and all their back-end systems and all the processes that they use and all the way they select their books, all the way they buy their books. All of those systems are built to not see Canadian books at all. They just see books.
I think there's opportunity though to help. And I disagree with you in terms of the data. I've not seen that data you're referring to, Jim. So it'd be good to get that. I've not seen anything in fact, I think there's a lack of comprehensive research around what the holdings are in public libraries in terms of Canadian content. And partly it is because it's difficult to identify. We can't even agree on what is Canadian. So I think the other challenge is, now I lost my train of thought. Shoot.
Come back to it in a second because I want to turn to Barb.
Okay.
Barb, you've had real success in promoting Canadian, as you were telling us before, with the flag. Do you have difficulty in sourcing Canadian? Do you have difficulty in recommending Canadian to people who are coming into your bookstore? Do they come in themselves knowing what it is they want to buy?
Okay, so I'll start with, do we have, the way an independent bookstore can help sell Canadian books. And I'm going to use the Truth and Reconciliation report as a starting point. So after they issued their report, before that, we did have a First Nations section, and it mainly had Drew Hayden Taylor and Tom King. But after that,
There are others?
there were a few others. But after that, I decided that, and I'm sure many Canadian independent bookstores have done this. After that, I decided it was part of our job to help Canadians understand the Truth and Reconciliation recommendations. So I was very lucky in that I had a First Nations woman help me understand how many amazing books there are by First Nations writer. So that section went from being very small to being almost our best-selling section. And people were thrilled to find it. I didn't know that those bookstores, that those books were available, and I'm a bookseller. So you really, really have to dig. And I think independents could do this because they all have their different areas of interest there, and we're all committed. Another thing that I wanted to mention, I don't even know if it's part of your question, Victor, but in Quebec, there's a relationship between libraries and bookstores.
Everybody pay attention to this. It is totally different from English Canada. It is a unique
Libraries have
thing.
to buy from bookstores, and they have to be accredited bookstores, but they buy their books from bookstores. Now, this can only help both. It would, especially bookstores, because we do have institutional sales, but there's like this room to grow, and we don't, I don't understand why this hasn't been happening in Canada, in the rest of Canada.
Okay, so Drew mentioned the importance of being on curriculum in a school. And yet, how do you source in a school if the source doesn't know, if the provider doesn't know that something is available or something is selling well?
Okay, so I'll just give you, we have really big institutional sales with our Board of Education, because there is a person at the board who is in charge of, I think it's LGBTQ and First Nations issues. And we work with her really closely, and she buys from us quite often. And we're even, I think, meeting quite often. Sometimes the board has to get a quote if it's over a certain amount. And we're even beating Amazon in terms of the discounts we are giving the board. So I think most boards have people who are experts. And her name is Kalinda Klein. She's First Nations herself. She knows what she wants, and she's curious. And so we work together, and it's been really terrific.
Fantastic.
Can I jump in here, Victor? I now remembered what I wanted to say. So I think I appreciate that he's referred to research, and I really do think there's an opportunity here, and perhaps with some government support, to do more comprehensive research about the Canadian reading for pleasure experience. And while BookNet absolutely does amazing work, they don't include research of usage, so digital usage, and that's given the increasing demand and usage. And not all libraries, most libraries don't participate in the BookNet data gathering. So I think that's an opportunity. If you're okay, Victor, I'd like to respond to Barb's comment about the Quebec model.
Sure.
And I think there are pros and cons to that, Barb. And if you looked at the state of public libraries in Quebec, they're quite different than the rest of Canada. So that funding, while going to collections, is not being put towards physical library spaces and buildings and innovative services that our public libraries and communities want and need. So I think there's a balance there. So that's one model, but I think you'd have to look at the holistic impact of that program on public library service generally.
I do have to say that many years ago, the Guelph Public Library used to buy a lot of books from us, and that all disappeared. So I'm not sure, but I think it's an issue that deserves looking,
Yeah, I
studying.
agree. I agree. Often public libraries, when they bring in authors, have speaking events. They feature local booksellers, and I know Toronto Public Library has a program right now, even with virtual, that they link to local booksellers to buy the speakers' titles. So I do think there's more opportunity there, Barb, for us to highlight our local booksellers for sure.
Well, maybe just one more thing. Just librarians should all know that there's a new Canadian Independent Booksellers Association. And so any relationship between a library and a bookstore, I think, is a great thing.
Absolutely. I agree.
But we're still faced with the statistics that show us the decline in sale of Canadian published books.
Sales and reading, Victor.
Say this again?
Sales and reading.
Sales and
And
reading,
reading,
yes,
yeah.
because it's not available.
Mm-hmm.
And going at this from my experience in dealing with films, particularly feature film, but not just feature film, of course, made for television film, made for streaming film. To take an example, the Schitt's Creek, which has won so many awards, but if you watch it, no Canadian name, no Canadian place name, no Canadian situation is ever mentioned in Schitt's Creek. It's all about, can I get to New York? Can I get back to Hollywood? Right? So Canada is the shame that dares not mention its name. Canada does not come out of the closet when it comes to made for television video, made for broad cinemas for distribution. Bring it now back to books and ask ourselves, are we headed in the same direction on books where the distribution of books becomes more and more difficult? Drew was talking about all his many books, but if you go through his listing, you see that he has been totally involved with Canadian publishers, Cormorant as a name, other Canadian publishers. If these Canadian publishers, I'm looking at you on the screen, Jim Lorimer, if these Canadian publishers are having difficulty in being recognized and being sourced, then what becomes the future for authors like Drew?
So you can already see, this is really evident, especially in children's publishing in Canada, that because the Canadian market, and in spite of what Drew says, the school, the purchases by schools for school libraries have drastically fallen off, and the purchases for classrooms have drastically fallen off. So that there are only remnants of a school library market left in English Canada. But what's happened is that the publishers, and there are many of them who are very successful Canadian children's publishers, and I've found the same thing myself. I'm now selling more copies, because we publish, especially in Toronto, we publish more children's books than we do adult books right now. We sell more copies of our Canadian books that are very explicitly set in Canada too, because our fiction is realistic fiction in the US than we do in Canada. That didn't used to be the case, but it's because the Canadian market has shrunk. It's not that the US market is dramatically big, it's because the Canadian market has shrunk so badly. And what effect that's had on publishers is that it is leading to editorial strategies of, it's sort of verging on actually publishing American authors, except that's problematic for Canadian publishers because of the way the grants are structured that we all benefit from. But it does mean that publishers are look very closely at manuscripts and their potential to be sold in both markets, instead of thinking, I want to publish books for Canada. I want to write books about Canada. I want kids to learn about Canadian experience. So it's fine for us to publish biographies of hockey players that are known in the States, but it's not so great to publish kids' biographies of boxers who are very important in Canadian experience, but are unknown in the US. That's the sort of thing that's happening. But it's not because there isn't an audience and a readership in Canada for books. It's the way that the invisibility of Canadian books in Canada has led to greater and greater presence of American books, basically. And the channels that can deliver books to readers, the channels that have the ability to do that, that are most open, the independent bookstore, the channel, which is successful but small. The public libraries are more important than the indie bookstores put together in terms of the number of people they reach and the books they deliver. But the actual presence of Canadian books in public library collections has been shrinking, and it's shrunk. And I'm glad that Pilar says that her Canadian novels are circulating at a steady rate over the last 5 years. But the question is, what is the presence of Canadian novels? If you went to any library in Canada looking for one of Drew's novels, you have about a 1 in 3, 1 in 5, 1 in 6, 1 in 7 chance of finding that book in the library that you walk into. And and so the whole discovery, learning, finding books you want to read, circle that Pilar was talking about, just doesn't happen because the books aren't there. And the books aren't there not because the librarians don't like them, but because they rely on a whole structure in the marketplace of systems and software and information about books, which is called metadata, that largely doesn't see Canadian in a Canadian book. They just see book.
Right, and I think that's where the independent publishers could do some initial, add those metadata tags to help the discovery of selectors in that content. So I just want to go back to something you said, Jim. You said that reading has gone down in Canada, but the latest BookNet study about leisure reading in Canada showed that 8 in 10 Canadians read, and that has remained steady for the last 5 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think.
I agree that there's no big decline. Any decline there's been is compared to newspapers, compared to magazines. Yeah. And actually the great thing about the BookNet data is if you look at them, BookNet also asks Canadian readers, what do they think about Canadian authors and Canadian books? And you get this very high percentages of Canadian readers being very positive. We did it in the Atlantic.
That's Barb's experience, right? Barb just pointed out, if she puts the flag on,
it puts the books out
and
there.
we put flags on too in libraries, so that's absolutely, people they're looking for those flags. Barb's the same experience we have in libraries.
But your software doesn't support it. Your business system, your suppliers don't support it. You say the publishers need to provide the information. Actually, it's been there now for 10 years. I was involved in the struggle to get it into the American system.
But not always, though. So I think that's maybe the conversation we can have. Maybe we can commit to doing that, working together to provide better access.
We have to have.
Yeah.
All right, I have one more question, even though we have to go to the audience, and I'm sure there are people who are going to have questions. I am assiduous, that's a good word, assiduous at reading book reviews.
And writing them.
And writing them. You don't know how much work it takes. I actually read the book before I review it. Can you imagine?
That's a good practice.
I don't even just read the introduction and the conclusion. I actually read the book. So, time for some jokes. Drew, time for some jokes. I look at the book reviews in the Ottawa Citizen, National Post. There are no Canadian book reviews. There are only American books that are being reviewed, sometimes English books, and they're reviewed from the Washington Post, goddammit.
There aren't many.
I think actually, Victor, I think that the Star does a pretty good job at indie authors.
The
And-
Star stands out. The Toronto Star
Yeah,
stands out.
but I
The
found in the
Globe and
last,
Mail, hardly. A little bit in the Globe and Mail.
I found in the last 20 years that, especially with Globe reviews, like it used to be, if a book was in the reviewed in the Globe, we would really, of course, run out of it because we didn't know it was being reviewed. But people don't seem to care as much. And also the CBC, like, oh my God, like Peter Zosky used to sell so many
Did.
books. And the CBC, well, I think they're more interested in music than they are in literature at this point. But that has been, the CBC really helps sell books, and I can't say that that's still the case.
Drew?
The Canada Reads program that
Yeah, but there's every other day of the, there's 365 days in the year. They
That's
used to do book. They used to talk about books. Books was part of Canadian culture, and I don't.
Sheila
sense
Rogers
that.
still does, I think.
Yeah,
but I
but
think
she has a tiny show. Like
She does.
I'm talking about their main radio shows.
Victor, I think you raise a good point in terms of, I think, our newspapers they used to have lots of space for reviews, literary reviews, and I think we're seeing less and less space devoted to featuring Canadian content these days, for sure.
Drew, a last question to you. You said now this COVID time has been a good time for writing, and books are going to be coming out. How are you going to be involved in promoting those books?
That's a good question. Actually, I was talking with one of the publishers at Penguin Vantage Random House, and I asked her if
He
she's
called it Bertelsmann.
I asked if they're expecting to have a rush of books come in from all the writers sitting around not doing much, and she told me, no, not really, because I had said, in a year's time we'll have an explosion of children, divorces, and novels. And she
Depending
says
on
she
your
can't
age.
speak about the children of the divorces, but she said, I don't think there's going to be a lot of novels. A lot of my writers are too stressed out to write.
Oh.
She says, I'm not expecting a lot. They're dealing with other issues in their life right now to worry about going to that place writers go in order to write. So she's not expecting a bunch of writers. And also getting back to what you're saying about the state of publishing and sales and that going down. I think it was Mark Cote at Corman Press who said, if you want to make a small fortune in publishing, you have to start off with a big fortune. Now back to your original question. I'm worried about what we're doing right now, Zoom, of how prevalent that's going to be. I love going to book fairs. I love going to authors festivals. I love traveling the country. I love going at 3 o'clock in the morning for Chinese food in downtown Winnipeg or Vancouver with writers I'd read but never met. I miss that, and I'm so worried at the lasting effect COVID and Zoom culture is going to have on the writing world. I have been basically about a year ago, I was in Brazil, Germany, Australia, Arizona, New Mexico, Vancouver, all these places from about, I think, November to first week of March, all those different places. And I haven't been anywhere since. I miss the pungent aroma of jet fuel. I don't know what's going to happen, but I am worried, and I got my fingers crossed that some things are going to change, some things are not going to change, but I hope we get to go out and sell the book. I know not a lot of writers. I know many writers who hate that part of the job, but I actually quite like it. It gets me out of the house. Writing keeps me at this table, focused in my own little universe. I like to get out and make sure there are other people in that universe.
Good. That sounds
Very
good.
well put. I'm just wondering, Ange, are there any questions that are coming in that you want us to be focused on?
Yeah, I'll give you the first question. The first question is the number of printings of a particular Canadian title also in decline, either because of small sales or in smaller initial printings. That is my impression as a writer, and noting the fate of Friends books as well. If so, this means our titles go out of print very quickly. If you don't buy them right away, they can vanish, except, God bless them, the indie bookstores and the public libraries who keep our books on their shelves longer than 6 weeks.
6 weeks.
Well, it is the case that print runs are going down, but the other thing that's happening that I think is really important to know is that that book printers are way more efficient now at being able to produce small quantities of books that sell out. So actually, a publisher who tells you that your book is out of print and can't be reprinted is a publisher who's telling you that he or she doesn't think there are any more copies to be sold, because we're reprinting quantities of 25, 50, and we're not losing money when we sell those books. We don't make that much, but we're not losing money when we do those kinds of things. So the smallness is a reflection of what I've been saying about the decline of the market. Nobody prints 5,000 copies. Nobody prints 5,000 copies of a book where all the books like it are selling 1,000 and 1,500 copies. And that's what's happened. Books that used to sell 3, 5, 10,000 are now selling 1, 2, 3,000. And so that's why print runs are smaller, because the market isn't there the access to readers has been greatly diminished, and that's going back to the writers.
Barb, I'm going to come to you in a second. Jim, choose your words carefully. You're not saying the market isn't there. You're saying the access for publishers is not there.
Yes, the system that moves the book through from, but actually to speak to what COVID is doing to the book market, to sort of follow up on what Drew said, a really interesting thing is that Chapters Indigo have experimented with putting a lot more emphasis on local regional titles in Atlantic Canada in the 3 months before Christmas. And they worked with my publishing company in Halifax plus 2 others, Nimbus and Goose Lane. And we did a sort of a promotion thing with them thanks to COVID support that came from Ottawa. So we had money to spend so we could afford to do this. And it had a dramatic effect on the sales of those books in those stores. I would say we sold 3 times as many copies of the books we published in Halifax than we expected to sell. Because
what was done that was different? Explain, what was done that was different?
Access. So when you walked into the store, that right in the center aisle, just like you could have in the library, the first thing you run into are these tables right in the center aisle. We were the second or first table, and then the table was covered with really attractive variety of Atlantic books about Atlantic subjects. And what I was going to say is that Chapters is now setting up to do that across the country with Canadian, local, and regional books, not international books. They've already done it they've been doing it with international books for decades. Now they're going to try it with Canadian, because people, thanks to COVID, have seem to be much more responsive to what's local, what's meaningful, and I would say also they're responsive to figuring out what's going on in their own country instead of being mesmerized by what goes on in the States.
Barb Minnette, you responded several times as Jim was talking about, number 1, short runs, short print runs. Number 2, the availability of books because of a short print run. And you were also responding with your head nodding on the promotional side of things. So please share your response, share your thoughts.
Okay, so as I mentioned at the beginning, our service from distributors is much, much better. So we can get books now in 3 or 4 days. So I think that that's really great. If a book was out of print and it can be reprinted in small quantities. We do have a power table or 2 in our store, but mainly our bookstore is filled with shelves of titles of 1s or 2s. It's like more of a browsing paradise, but they're both important. And what was the other question?
That's okay. You've already touched, because you talked about promotion. We have more questions. Ange.
Yeah, the next question from an attendee is, how do the panelists feel about the influence that channels for production, especially the need for an author to be thinking about getting into the curriculum, may have over what gets published, or more importantly, for what a writer may write? This seems an important consideration for issues of free expression. How are the forms of distribution affecting what gets written?
Okay, panelists, how are the forms of distribution affecting what gets written?
Victor, can I just quickly say, I think that the independent Canadian publishers, there's more than 100 of them, are an extremely successful at producing a very diverse range of books of all different kinds by all different kinds of writers. It's the actual richness of what's being published is better, greater than ever. But the trouble is that nobody knows about it. You can't see it. You can't go to the library. You can't go. These books only exist in publisher catalogs, and they're scattered like dust across the library systems in Canada. I found that there were 4,000 different books Canadian authored books bought by a sample of 25 library systems in Canada last year. Yet only a handful of those books show up in no matter which library you go into. A handful, 19 of the books of the 4,000 you can count on finding in any library you walk into. All the others are scattered, and there's like a huge number that are bought in tiny quantities, like 50 copies for all the 520 libraries in this survey.
Okay, let's blame Pilar. Pilar.
Yes, exactly. He wasn't going to do that, but he is.
It's not Pilar. It's the
books?
systems. It's the
I
system that
think
she sits
it's
in.
not realistic to expect libraries to be a repository for everything that's published in Canada. And I think my point with the digital and the competition for content is that libraries are buying that because users want that. So we are buying video games, we're buying graphic novels, we're buying e-audio, we're buying, so it's not, that would be unrealistic to expect us to be repositories for every single thing that's published for Canadians, or that's published by Canadian publishers. So I think we buy what people want. That's what public libraries are about, and also have a commitment to ensuring that we have Canadian content in our public libraries. One of the things that I think is important to note too is our demographics have changed considerably in the last 30 years. We have a much higher population of new immigrants, new Canadians, and those individuals want to read materials in their own language, published from their own country. So the library budget is also supporting content to serve those members of our community.
Right.
Pilar, your point about the availability of books. Nobody would say that an individual branch library should be adding 4,000 new Canadian authored titles a year. But what you would say is that there are hundreds of Canadian books that are selling in respectable quantities. Barb and her fellows can sell hundreds of copies of books that you can't find in your local library. And I mean, to me, it's like, that of course you can't buy every book that's being published, or even every Canadian book, but there's a big difference between the tiny representation that exists right now and a more fulsome display. And what's more, even if you decided today that you wanted to implement a policy like that, your systems, the plumbing that you rely on makes it about as impossible as possible to do. So it isn't that there's one thing that needs to change here. We're living in a world where we've stumbled into a structure that doesn't work for Canadian cultural products. And our biggest cultural institution for Canadian culture is public libraries. I think it's $2 billion of public money is spent every year on public libraries. They can and should be leaders in giving Canadians access, not to the books that are being written and published. And actually today, they're doing less than Chapters, and they're doing way less than indie bookstores, who are doing exactly the same as libraries, responding and providing books that people are interested in reading. It's just they're doing a way better job at it because their systems permit it.
you and I are going to agree to disagree, Jim. And because from my perspective and those of my Canadian Urban Libraries Council, there is a lack of research on what the holdings of Canadian public libraries. You've got your 25. We've got like hundreds of libraries just in the province of Alberta. So I think there's research to be done, and I think that that would be a good investment for us to invest in what market research would support publishers in providing content that Canadians want.
Is
and
there a reticence
usage.
by libraries to?
Pardon me, Victor?
Is there a reticence or reluctance by libraries to participate in data collecting?
Oh, not at all. I mean, even the research that we did with just over the last 5 years, that's probably underrepresented because, and it's complicated. We aren't able to analyze because there isn't the data there in terms of how it speaks to software. So there's no reticence at all. None whatsoever.
But going back to the original question.
Thanks, Barb.
Going back to the original question, I think the questioner wanted to know whether that would affect the artist and what the writer and what the writer would write, or if he or she or they could write something that they think people might want, but that's not really what they want. I mean, Drew could speak to this.
Could I just jump in? I think that's an example of what we're doing in Edmonton, and we're not alone across Canada, is promoting self-published local content. We even have a book printer, a whole process in our makerspace, our fabrication lab, where people can come and print titles. So I think there's many opportunities for people to self-publish if they're just entering the publishing.
We have a whole lot of questions coming in. Let's have another one. Ange Holmes.
Yeah, the next, an attendee says, something I do when I look on Libby for books is I start at the bottom of offerings because that's where the Canadian books seem to be. Is there a way to get platforms like Libby to highlight Canadian books?
That's exactly my point. The app that Overdrive uses is called Libby. And there's algorithms in there, and I don't know enough about Overdrive, but that's our experience, that sort of the long list of published materials is the last thing on their list of priorities in terms of promotion. So that's something we need to investigate, but there's an interest that seems to be pervasive with Overdrive and Libby is promoting the best sellers, that are in the United States, not necessarily what's Canadian.
We're talking when it comes to Canada, when Libby comes to Canada, Overdrive is Underdrive.
But we're talking about the plumbing that the libraries pay for and use.
It's a platform, platform that, and there are very few of them. It's a monopoly, really, called Overdrive. It's a company based out of Japan now, operated in the US as well. That is the how we get e-content, so e-audio and e-books.
But here's the point of cultural responsibility. In Quebec, the public libraries and the booksellers and the publishers work together to develop a Quebec-based platform for ebook lending.
And we worked with eBound for years to try and do that with the Canadian Urban Libraries Council. And so
the Canadian, yes, Canadian public libraries spend, I think it's but you would probably know, $20 million or $25 million a year on their Overdrive platform and the books they buy through that platform.
It's not the platform you purchase, and you don't even purchase. We actually lease their licenses. Right. We don't own the content.
What's the point? The point is that if you're relying on American systems, you get American product. The point is that the libraries are culturally responsible. They'll develop a platform that works for Canadian writers.
There's nothing been developed. And believe me, Jim, this is not unique to a Canadian problem. Libraries in the United States are also concerned about this platform and want to develop their own, and they haven't come up with anything yet.
Okay, we've really identified something here. Another question, Ange?
Yeah, I know there's been some talk around the Quebec situation in Quebec. Could you talk more about what the publishers, writers, bookstores, and libraries in Quebec do right?
Barb, do you want to talk to that?
Well, I just know that they must collaborate. I don't have direct experience of them. We used to collaborate with our library many years ago, but Jim, you would probably know
Jim, you
more.
wrote about this recently. Could you add something to it?
So the Quebec system, really, really briefly, is the government in Quebec requires public money being spent on books to be spent in bookstores. And for bookstores to be eligible for the public money spending by schools and libraries, the bookstores agree to keep a minimum quantity, a good inventory of new and recent and backlist Canadian authored books. So the bookstores stock Canadian books at a far greater level than even Barb's bookstore. And they get the business from schools and libraries, and customers who walk into the bookstores encounter a rich range of Quebec books and buy them. So in Quebec, Victor, you worried about the future of publishing in Canada. I don't worry about Quebec publishing. Quebec publishing is in a really good solid. They have good market share that looks like they have more than 50% of the books that are read in Quebec are by Canadian authors. Quebec is a completely different situation, but it is hugely challenging to think about how to use that precedent in English Canada, because it means that in Quebec they have 280 bookstores, including in the Ile de la Madeleine, which is a community of only a few thousand people. But they have the bookstore, a strong independent bookstore network because of the way that public policy made it happen.
There's a piece of background on that, which is in France, going back to the late 1940s.
Right, yeah, they have to do that too.
You had to have a quota of screen time devoted to French films, and they began to use the bookstores as the distribution network for books. So cinemas were used as the distribution point for French film, whereas all our Canadian cinemas were owned by Americans, and bookstores were being used for distribution points. Quebec adapted that based upon constitutional law and what you can do. And so Quebec was able to adapt that into the bookstore system. And through the bookstores supply both school boards, individual schools. So this is back to Drew's point. Drew publishes a book, or as a publisher publishes a book. A local bookstore picks it up and says, here is the latest from Drew Hayden Taylor, and is able to make the connection to the school. And it's put onto the grade 11, grade 12 syllabus, perhaps for next term. And that's another 50, 100 books sold. Let's go to another question. Ange?
Yeah, the next question is, do you think if reviews of Canadian books were supplied free of charge to newspapers, they would publish them instead of picking up cheap reviews of US books from US sources?
Oh, good question. Drew, how much do you charge for a review when you write a review?
I used to write reviews, but I was, for obvious reasons, I was given native books to review, and unfortunately, I know all the native writers, so I was basically reviewing my friends, which is not a good thing to do.
No.
So I don't do that anymore. You get a flat fee from the newspaper, the magazine, or whatever, but it's been a long time since I did that. I don't know how it works anymore. I'm old.
I'm going to offer an answer to the questioner. Obviously, the National Post system, Post Media, will be paying to the Washington Post something for the actual review that they pick up from the Washington Post. Not very much, but reviewers are not paid very much. When I review a book, I'll see a good $200. So we're not talking about a lot of money.
Well, could I just mention one thing about local newspapers, which there are a few left. So I write for a local newspaper called Guelph Today. It's, of course, our newspapers are only online, but I do these reviews for free because it comes from the bookshelf, so it's kind of marketing. But I think that local papers are just as might be quite a fruitful venue for reviews, because people seem to read them.
And of course, I read your reviews when I went onto your website. And once you've read a review, you're so much more inclined towards that book and to find out more. Jim, in the promotion of content that you were part of in Halifax before Christmas and the run up to Christmas, were there more local reviews being published? Was that part of the promotional side?
Ironically, no, but what there was a lot of Chapters has a very powerful weekly email that they send to their customers.
Right.
Our books were included in their weekly, has never happened before, were included in their weekly email. There was social media support. So there was a lot of, but book reviews, you know, I was just searching for the data here to show, you know, how it, because there's great data on the power of everything from, you know, book reviews to word of mouth to social media and stuff. And word of mouth still is the most important way that people find out about books to read. And book reviews book reviews are small. But you know what's really big is browsing in bookstores. That's how people find out about books. Browsing in libraries is how they find out about books. And so the most important thing that Pilar can do to create awareness of books is to put the books in the library, not review them, you know, not even get the author to give a talk. Just get the books in the library.
No, disagree.
That's what the data
Next
shows.
question, Ange Holmes. Ange.
Yeah, the next question is, during my time volunteering at my local library in high school, Hoopla was a recommended service for borrowing books, movies, music, ebooks, and audio here in Ontario. You can use your library card through your institution and borrow content. Is that a Canadian third-party source or American? And if it is, does that present a threat to Canadian content?
Pilar?
Yes, that is a third-party American platform for e-content, and I'm not as familiar with Hoopla in terms of how it sort of curates and promotes material, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's similar to Overdrive. I should also mention for our collaboration with the Alberta Publishers Association, we do use it's called CanTook as a platform. It does have some challenges though in the back end, and then again it's another platform. So I think we're also eager to provide a good customer experience, and the more platforms, the more confusing it is for people to borrow.
And another question?
Yeah, the next one is, what about systems like what CanCon did for music in the Canadian industry? Can this happen for books?
Always an interesting question.
And that's what's achieved in the Quebec system, right? The Quebec system effectively sets a minimum inventory that bookstores voluntarily meet because of the business that comes when it's called accreditation, when they become accredited. And actually at our think tank, we proposed, there's a great interest in cheap ways of shipping books in in Canada right now, partly because of COVID, right? The Canada Post charges an arm and a leg to ship books for anybody who's shipping books. But ironically, there's a great rate, which is available right now only to public libraries, where a public library can ship a book to a reader or another library branch. The Canada Post press release said it would cost you or me $30 to ship these 3 books on their system, but the library pays $1.30, says Canada Post. So right now, our think tank has suggested that bookstores who meet a minimum content requirement of 20% should have access to this the library book rate, and publishers should too. And we think that voluntarily, a lot of bookstores would say, well, gee, if I can up my Canadian inventory by a few percentage points and get access to a very, very economical book rate, we'll do it. We think that maybe even Heather Reisman has complained a lot about the high cost of sending books to her online customers. We think even maybe Chapters would find that such an inducement that it would lead them to decide to increase their inventory of Canadian authored books. So there are ways of achieving what amounts to a content.
That would save us thousands of dollars.
Yeah, that
millions
is,
to heaven.
it's called the Library Book Rate. And just recently, the Canadian Urban Libraries Council, I'm the actual past chair, has supported that initiative request to Heritage Canada, Jim. So just another example of what we're doing to support our Canadian publishers.
Well,
And
and
booksellers.
which is a
I
good
want
thing.
you all to know that historically, the first cultural program of Canada,
Exactly.
before the creation of Canada. Now, of course, we can go back to time immemorial. But while we had the state called the Upper and Lower Canada, the postal subsidy rate for the distribution of newspapers and the distribution of books was the first one. And it was carried through Confederation and onwards and onwards. Less available now, somewhat available. Another question, Ange, we're nearing the end.
Victor, can I just jump in 2 seconds here? I want to clarify the Quebec situation is only, it's not Canadian, it's Quebec authors.
Right.
So that's a different, that's not Canadian, just to clarify.
I don't think that's accurate, actually, but that's enough. It doesn't really matter. For Quebec authors are what matters. Yeah.
Lucky Alberta. Next question. This is going to be the last question, Ange.
Okay, the next question is when chapters first came into Edmonton in the university area, they promoted and displayed lots of local writers and books until they drove the several indie bookstores in the same neighborhood out of business. And then chapters promotion of Read Local faded away, along with the big comfy reading chairs. Is this happening elsewhere?
Ooh.
So the answer to that question is that's what happened, maybe. I actually didn't see that happen in Halifax, and I don't think it happened. I didn't see it. But here's the point. Today, they're trying to figure out, they're in the process of figuring out how to reverse that. That's the key thing. That's a big, that has big implications for everybody if chapters treats Canadian books with greater priority. And they're actually even changing their plumbing. No, I've been talking about the importance of plumbing. Up to now, chapters hasn't had plumbing that knew about Canadian books, but they're changing it so that they can do that. So it's potentially a really positive development following from COVID, following from, because their consumer surveys are telling them that people want this.
Before Jim Turk comes on to say thank you, 20 seconds or less. Drew, do you think we're having problems or do you think we're okay?
Well, it's with COVID happening, all the normal methods of understanding and rating things are askew. So it's really difficult to make a definite decision about your question. I think we're still breathing, but we're on a precipice, and it could be pushed over the edge. So I'm gonna sit on a fence on this one.
Oh, not possible. Barb, your view.
I think that we're okay. I hope in the next 5 years, you'll see a rise in independent booksellers, which, by the way, I hate to mention the United States, but the number of indie bookstores in the US has gone up drastically in the last 2 or 3 years. And I hope that will happen in Canada. And if so, I think that will be only healthy for the Canadian bookselling community.
Pilar, you're always optimistic.
Well, you know, the BookNet study on Canadian publishing in 2019 said it 3/4 of the publishers surveyed said that they were healthy financially. So back to Drew's point, COVID-19 certainly has had an impact. I do think, though, there's work to be done. And I think all of us on the panel are natural allies, and we can work together rather than blaming.
Jim, you know the truth.
Well, my truth would be, yeah, the publishers are healthy, but that's because of government grants. And, you know, and it's crazy for the government to be keeping on giving greater grants to people whose success at connecting readers with books is going down. So, but my take on it, Victor, is that it isn't enough to be Canadian. You have to actually work you have to act Canadian. And so we're in a challenging situation, but it's one that we have to reverse. We can't watch, the curve is going like this. We can't just watch it until it gets down to, as you said at the beginning, to the situation that Canadian filmmakers are in, where they make great films that nobody sees. It was an accident that I bumped into cottagers and Indians on I think it was on Gem. It was a total accident. But when I saw it, I thought, hey, I'm going to watch that. It shouldn't be like that.
And I'm going to finish with that mention of Gem. Gem is a gem, and it's under promoted and harder to use, but there's so much good stuff on it. Jim Turk, we're waiting for you.
Well, listen, thank you, Victor. I want to thank Pilar and Jim and Barb and Drew for a remarkably interesting, engaging conversation, and to compliment Victor on his skills in moderating, helping make it a reality.
Well done, Victor.
I also want to thank the audience for joining us and for your excellent questions. Tomorrow afternoon, or probably tomorrow afternoon, a podcast, a video recording of this session will be on the Center for Free Expression website. So anybody who's missed it or missed part of it will have a chance to see it. That website is cfe.ryerson.ca. As well, we're going to ask each of the panelists for some suggestions of what they would recommend to anyone who'd like to read a little bit more on this subject. And so there'll be a link on our website next to the podcast if any of you would like to pursue any of this a little further and read a little bit more about it. I'd also like to welcome the audience to consider attending our next event, which is going to be a week. It's going to be on February 24th, next week at 4 p.m. on a very different subject. It's called Transforming Call-Out Culture. It features Loretta Ross. It's a conversation with Loretta Ross, who's a remarkable African-American feminist activist, public intellectual, and for this year and next year is a visiting professor at Smith College, who spent her life in activist work ranging from working in the first rape crisis center in the United States in Washington, D.C., heading the National Organization of Women's Women of Color programs, to working for the National Anti-Klan Network and Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Coalition. She's going to be really exploring how we can transform the call-out culture, which seems to be so prevalent and so harmful in many ways. And she's going to be having this conversation with Asim Ahmed, who's a Toronto-based writer and community scholar whose first book of essays on identity and social justice is coming out from Between the Lines quite shortly. So this is a very different event. I hope you'll tune in for this. For more information about any of our upcoming events or podcasts of our many past events that may interest you, again, go to our website, cfe.ryerson.ca. And thank all of you very much for joining us today. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.